Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. How we treat the poor often, though not always, reflects how we view God. Sure, there could be some unbelievers who treat the poor very well, some uber wealthy people even giving most of their fortunes to help problems that are faced by those poor in societies. But it should be believers who should be exemplary in how they treat the poor. In fact, one cannot be a true believer in God and go about treating the poor poorly. We may not all have the wealth required to help everyone, but we shouldn't mistreat anyone, especially those who are poor. In this last section of Nehemiah 5, we're going to be able to compare how Nehemiah treated the poor with how the nobles had been treating the poor, as we saw earlier on in chapter 5. So, if you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to be reading today from verses 14 through 19. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Nehemiah chapter 5, beginning at verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work, and at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. In the last lesson, we learned that the nobles and rulers in Judea were acting contrary to the law of Moses and charging usury on the poor for lending them money and food, and seemingly not giving them back their land at the year of Jubilee. If these Jews wanted to be said to be following God, then they needed to stop this behavior and correct their wrongs. Correction here would be returning the land that had failed to be given back and also paying back the usury that was illegally taken. Coming out of verses 14 to 19, and we find how Nehemiah contrasts that behavior with the behavior himself. Now, having read through it already, to the untrained eye, we might think that Nehemiah is boasting here to the point of arrogance, almost like the Pharisee did in the parable of the publican and Pharisee found in Luke chapter 18. Now, I don't believe Nehemiah is doing that for a minute. Rather, I believe he is providing the nobles in Judea an example that he desired for them to follow. It's sort of like what Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 when discussing the liberties that he did without so as to save the Gentiles. There, Paul was not calling attention to himself, trying to obtain praise from the Corinthians, but was instead laying down a principle that he would do anything lawful to further the gospel and help others. Let's see what Nehemiah's example was. The first thing of note was that in verse 14, we get an explicit verse that tells us Nehemiah's position was as governor of Judea. Up to this point, all we could say for sure is that Nehemiah was given a position of authority to rebuild the wall. There could have been a different person who was governor of Judea. That notion is put to bed here. We also learn how long Nehemiah was governor of Judea, which was 12 years. This would be from 445 BC to 433 BC. Recall back from chapter 2 that Nehemiah's commission wasn't permanent. Artaxerxes expected him to return. We now know when Nehemiah did this. Coincidentally, this statement also tells us that Nehemiah couldn't have been written until at least 433 BC because that year of Artaxerxes' reign is given. Unlike some of the other governors, though, that had governed Judea, Nehemiah didn't take a tax from the people in the form of money or food. Now we know of one governor of Judea since the captivity, and that was Zerubbabel. Ezra had the authority of a governor, but he is never called one, so we cannot say for sure that he was. But in the almost 100 years since the captives' return, they more than likely had many governors. Was Nehemiah condemning people like Zerubbabel for having taken payment from the people he governed? No, he wasn't. For those people were doing good work and deserved to be paid. Nehemiah was laying down a principle, though, that they did not have to be paid. They could work for free and live off any money they had. Being the cupbearer for the king and part of the king's court, a position that he did not seem to relinquish, would have likely meant that Nehemiah wasn't poor. Now, he wouldn't have been the richest man, but he certainly wouldn't have been the poorest either. That is likely how he was able to afford doing what he did here in Judea. He was still drawing a salary from the Persian king, and therefore didn't need one from the Jews. What Nehemiah was doing, though, was unusual. Back when the Israelites asked for a king in 1 Samuel 8, verses 11 to 17, listen to what God, through Samuel, told them would happen. And he said, "This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. He will set some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and he will give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants." Taking a salary or taking provisions was what was expected to be done by leaders, because being a leader was hard work. And there's nothing wrong with the leader doing so long as he wasn't taking advantage of his people or the poor. But Nehemiah had more than enough, so he thought, why would he take more from those who were suffering? Even his servants followed after him because Nehemiah took care of them too. This is a principle for us today. 1 Timothy 5, verse 18 does tell us that a worker is worthy of his wages. But sometimes it is prudent, when the laborer has more than enough, not to take wages from those who might have difficulty affording it. There's nothing wrong with being paid, but there's also nothing wrong in choosing to work for free either. But Nehemiah didn't just work for free, he also was hospitable, hosting 150 Jews and rulers at his table, among others. Even this didn't require him to take a wage. Why was Nehemiah so generous? Because at the heart of the matter, Nehemiah feared the Lord and wanted to do good, and because he wanted to be saved by the Lord from the sin that he knew could condemn him. No, Nehemiah wasn't saying that he couldn't be hospitable if he were an atheist, nor is he trying to earn his salvation. What he is saying, though, is that God is at the center of his thoughts. He always seeked to please God because he knew pleasing God would bring salvation, but displeasing God would bring damnation. It's a desire to obey God that spurs Nehemiah's actions, not simply for what Nehemiah could get out of it, but because glorifying God through our deeds is what God deserves and how God expects us to treat our fellow man. Nehemiah's example is one for us today. May we live up to it and serve God faithfully as well. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 7, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.